Hello, Cardstack community. This is Christy, the founding director of the Cardstack project, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, we're joined by Tom Trowbridge, the co-founder of Fluence Labs, to talk about peer-to-peer application, not just blockchain application, peer-to-peer applications that he's been working on. He's a veteran in the blockchain space, and we're so glad to have him join us for this fireside chat so we can take a look at Web3 in this inflection point and see where we can go from here and what other new application and use case we can capture with the research and development that different teams are working on. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Great to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Tom and I actually met about a year ago in the middle of COVID in Soho to chat about what we're working on in Cardstack, and obviously he was at the time beginning this new project, which is now taking a lot more progress than the thing and the Fluence Lab, and I want to give him an opportunity to talk a little bit about his journey into crypto Web3 so far, and what specifically he's working on in Fluence, and what makes him excited about what we're able to do in the near future.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I guess first a little bit on the background. So my introduction into kind of blockchain DLT was joining Hedera Hashgraph back in 2016 or 17. I basically joined Manson Lehman, who had a white paper at the time in a company called Swirls, and we're looking to build a public ledger. So basically joined them to help found the public expression of the Hashgraph consensus algorithm. And so from a standing start, we raised a bunch of money, hired a lot of people, and basically had to bring in kind of a blue chip governing council of companies that would actually own and govern the network. And so there was a lot of things to do very, very quickly. And as I kind of joke to people, that when you're building, especially in L1s, a lot of other protocols, you effectively are building a global organization from day one. You don't get the luxury of just having to focus on one little market and expanding it. So it was definitely baptism by fire for sure, and was exciting, and Hedera is doing very well. It's a top 30, and there have been some great use cases announced on it just over the past week. So from an institutional kind of use side, I think it's kind of unparalleled, but it still doesn't have kind of Web3 traction and really kind of some of the kind of credibility in the crypto community, I would say. But I think that will come at some point. But it was a terrific introduction to the technology, to the choices and trade-offs that people make with regard to different types of architecture. And really, I think is sort of one of the key tenets to understanding crypto is first you have to understand blockchain, then you have to understand Ethereum, and then you have to understand other L1s. And then from there, you kind of branch out and start to really grasp the whole ecosystem. But I feel like those are kind of the basic kind of fundamental elements that one needs to explore and have command of before you can actually expand much further beyond it.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to think of all the stuff that came before as a necessary curriculum. It's not like we move on and you can start from there. You still have to kind of learn foundational math and algebra before you can learn, I don't know, like
calculus or
right?
whatever. Yeah, exactly.
So that's the thing. Like each year that comes in, you need to know a little bit more. That's why I love talking to people who have been in this space for like long enough to see not only the cycles, which is interesting in its own right, but also the accumulation of technology knowledge and cultural and organizational necessity. How do you think that has helped you in your journey of thinking about what you want to do next, and
well,
what next step you want to take?
Well, it's interesting because there's some huge learnings that I took from Hedera for sure. And so I left there in 2019, and I was introduced to the Fluence team. They actually started that project in 2017, but Lasse introduced me to Evgeny, and I joined them as soon as my non-compete with Hedera was up. And even though it's not really a competitive element because it's not a layer one, but one of the things that I think that the team was very focused on at Fluence was building with the community and having lots of community involvement, lots of community dialogue, and having terrific inroads and links with the community across multiple kind of verticals and horizontals. And in this world, I think that's far more important. If you're an outsider coming into the space, you can architect a great solution, but it takes a lot of time for people to spend the time and energy on it because they just don't want to, there's only so many hours in a day, and they're going to focus and pay attention to and care about that which they kind of have affinity for. And even a great solution, if you're not in the community, is a much higher hurdle to getting adoption and getting traction. And so I feel like you really need to be in the inside. And if you're not, it's just you can succeed. It's just a much harder path.
Mm.
And so that was one of the kind of key elements I learned at Hedera, which I think has had and has a unbeatable technical solution, but is not doesn't have wider adoption, at least in the crypto community, because of its outsider status.
Yeah. Do you see that there are community of, different community, that DAO community, which are cultural community, not all of them, but a lot of them are like private clubs. There are development community who is interested in blockchain, and there's development community or people interested in programming language, and based outside blockchain, they may be interested in distributed application. Which community do you think resonate with this idea of a peer-to-peer application stack compared to a community interested in the digital asset, enterprise otherwise? How you define the community that you believe you have found that kind of like mutual appreciation?
Yeah, listen, that's hard because it crosses a lot of them. And so there's DAOs, and we're going to launch a DAO later this year. So the DAO, which will govern our protocol. So that element is certainly, is a direct link with those levels of communities, and allowing that type of, decentralized organization to govern the protocol is, I think, super important, and something that we certainly believe in and are moving forward towards. And with regard to DeFi, that is a community which is not an obvious one for us, because it doesn't enable kind of financial transactions out of the gate. But what it does do is composability is a huge core of what we're doing and what we're going to be offering, and the value that we think Fluence ultimately brings. So there is it sort of rhymes with that DeFi community. And so while it may not be, a next, eco or stable coin lending protocol, if you will, the lessons of composability are things that we're taking on. And so people who are invested in and understand the innovation, what drove the innovations in DeFi, I think will appreciate the composability of what we're doing, because that we're trying to take composability and make it even to a broader, more applicable across the whole software kind of world. And that, I think, is pretty powerful when you start to understand and see how that's been exhibited and deployed in DeFi.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that DeFi really show people the power of composable money. Like, but then there's composable software, composable identity, composable media, composable organization, composable analytic, composable design, composable services, composable economy, composable governance, right? Like, these are things that's barely been tapped into, but totally rooted in that kind of initial success that DeFi gives us. So I think DeFi, to me, has always been the trailblazer to introduce the word of composability, not as a nice decoration like green or whatever, but actually a fundamental new qualification of, well, yeah, great, but is the thing you're doing composable? And then it really breaks down the type of things where you actually have to do some rework.
Right.
to
Yeah.
justify it.
Yeah. No. 100%. And I think that is it is the other element worth saying is that also financial transactions seem to be the easiest to deploy composability, right? Because it's the simplest thing, because you've got sort of very simple units that you're moving around. Other software composability adds far more variance, and so it's more complex. So it makes sense for it to start with finance. Other composable applications are harder, and I think that's why they're going to follow.
Yeah, and so in your use case that you're thinking about Fluence, like solving some of the harder composability problem, from my understanding, again, I'm a technologist, but I'm not an expert in the distributed system space. What is the main kind of unlocking new variants? Is this making software backend API composers be more possible, or obviously your composable storage on one end? What is the like net breakthrough in terms of use case it enables with the type of new programming language and new orchestration language and the runtime
Yep.
and VM that Fluence
So
brings?
let me back up, because I talked about composability a little bit without describing the context for it. So let me back up for a second. So what Fluence is first, it's a peer-to-peer computation protocol. So it allows computation to happen outside of the traditional hub and spoke model. And so if you think about what a cloud network is, it has payments, it has storage, it has compute. And we clearly have seen payments solved within the crypto world. And we've clearly seen storage solved with, IPFS, Filecoin, storage, Arweave, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. But we don't have peer-to-peer compute. And compute, let me back up. Compute you do have with an EVM and with smart contract language, but that compute is expensive and is deterministic, and so up to date has been relatively slow, right? It's suitable only for cool, very simple smart contract types of compute, right? But that is decentralized compute, right? It happens over a network. And so if you're talking about general purpose, non-deterministic compute that does not happen on a hub and spoke model, that is what Fluence has developed. So what that allows is it frees you from a centralized API. It frees you from any of that kind of reliance on a single party or a single host to do the computation. And so what that means is you can write a script and a program that will go out, find a host, perform computation A or B or C, and then continue on to computation C, D, and E in other hosts if it's not available in host A. Host A is down, it can go to host B, et cetera. And so that is a terrific innovation. Once you have that, that allows a decentralized cloud. Now, there's a language, which you mentioned, called Aqua, which helps make this happen. And I'm going to explain kind of why that's critical, because creating peer-to-peer applications has all kinds of attributes, but it's not simple right now. It's incredibly complicated if you want to build it from scratch. And we've abstracted that out with Aqua to make this incredibly simple. But then the next piece of this, obviously is all open source, is creating a peer-to-peer license system so that code uploaded onto any Fluence host anywhere, that host will share a small part of that hosting revenue with the author of it. And so that's where the composability comes in, is that this is, rather than be on a proprietary AWS platform or Azure that you can't move around, here you can transfer and have any host host any code and pull software modules from any host to pull together and compose them into an application you want that could be running from hosts in different data centers run by different companies in different geographies, authored by different core developers. And so that has not been possible to date. And that is the whole solution that Fluence is working on. And we have the peer-to-peer compute functioning. It's working. You can see it now. The language is up and running. There's documentation you can see. And the next step is launching the DAO to govern the protocol, and then to have the peer-to-peer license system kind of launched and running. And that is kind of a later this year system. But that is kind of the whole scope of the project, which is big, because we think that changes kind of how software can potentially get made.
Absolutely. And what's most exciting about it is that compute in the previous era was like, oh, let's do compute, and like project like Golem or LivePeer is mostly on like really like commodity rendering and kind of like, tasks. And when we mean compute, we really mean like microservices, the pricing service that allows you to do search pricing for Uber. That's the compute we want. Real business logic, real value, not just commodity. I'm going to crunch some numbers and compress some video. Not that that's not valuable, but what's cool about it, at those projects pioneer this type of payment system, and some of them do probabilistic micropayment. You seem to be doing something like similar or differently. But the idea here that the attribution, whether you're storing files and getting some Filecoin for it, or you're running a program, it's really where we can borrow from these kind of more commodity versions of crypto infrastructure and use it for what is the most interesting thing, which is, what if the backend service of the world is composable and it's built as one single bill, but not controlled by one single company?
Correct. And that any smart author can come up with new ways or useful services that can be uploaded and then discovered and incorporated into that, no matter where they are, right? They don't have to be in Silicon Valley or New York City or Berlin to create code that then is useful and used. They can be anywhere. It can be uploaded, and they can and as discoverable and earn from that. And that's also super interesting, because it democratizes kind of the accessibility of useful code globally as well.
hmm Is this a locality in where the code goes, or is it replicate to all the peers? And Ethereum, for example, if I run a laptop with Ethereum or even a data center, it's running the same transaction for the same block all the time. How do you think about this whole global distribution and a parallelization that is maybe possible when your compute is not on that base blockchain layer?
Yeah, it's actually it's interesting in a couple ways. So first, as a host, you're free to choose whatever you want to host.
Mm-hmm.
And so you may want to host some things, may make sense for you, some may not. And so we think ultimately there'll be such a number of services that not every host will be able to or want to host everything, right? And so first of all, as a host, you choose, point one. Point two, the interesting thing is as you author something, that's pushed out to the network. You as the author no longer have any control over that whatsoever. That code is out there, is running. You can't stop it if you want to. Also
Mm-hmm.
means you can't insert any malicious code into it anymore because
Yeah.
it's out there and it's gone. And point three, you want to upgrade it, fine. You can set a new upgrade cycle for it. But if I've built an application running on V1, I'm no way, as long as I keep paying the host for V1, I don't get kicked off default and forced to do V2. So
Mm-hmm.
my dependencies, we think, remain consistent and unchallenged and valid, given every host is going to continue hosting something that people are paying them for, right? So you can see you can sort of break this kind of constant upgrade cycle that requires you to retool, because who knows what breaks once in your application once a V2 of one of your core kind of modules is updated. So that to us is also a very interesting part of it all.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges of centralized applications are only on version upgrade, they don't announce it or downtime, is that, the way the venture capital funding for SaaS product is that a lot of them has plans to get acquired. And when the acquire them, they may not want to keep that service around. Like how many product has been killed by Microsoft and Google alone, right?
Correct,
So
correct,
I think
correct,
this
correct.
idea of survivability of software and the data around the software seems to be a really a kind of a distinguishing point between a decentralized version of the software economy versus the centralized one, the SaaS and stuff like that. So what do you think, in addition to this kind of fairer payment and the survivability, the upgrade cycle, what do you think is the main benefit when someone say, hey, I want to build I don't know, a marketplace like Uber or Uber Eats on Fluence, compared to building it on a more centralized microservices stack that I think we've tried and true and figure out how to do it. Like, what is the main benefit beyond that you can kind of suggest developer to explore the decentralized way, especially with
So
full stack?
there's a couple benefits. One is there's certain basic ones, which is that it should be more resilient and it should be more censorship resistant. If you're building a marketplace that you're talking about, those may not be the key things you care about because those are not so
Mm-hmm.
sensitive in those areas. But the key point is you own your own data in this. And so you're not subject to trying to port your data after you have a successful business in Amazon or in trying to get it out of there is incredibly complicated and expensive. And so owning your own data
Mm-hmm.
is a critical piece of this. And so that to me is the biggest benefit. The second benefit, I think, is that it will be far faster to build on it because you'll have more, again, this is not day one, but at day 10, 20, 50, you'll have more choices and more composability. So you have more options. There's only so much right now. Amazon and Google have a terrific core suite of services that you can use and actually compose, right, to build an application. But they only can add and adjust those over X period of time. The more we open this up and then we open up, the more it's open in the world and people can contribute their services. We think that innovation will allow people to build far, far faster. And by the way, building on Amazon, you're still building centralized applications. So if you want to build a truly peer-to-peer application, that is not a simple thing to do using an AWS or other stack. And so I think if you want to build peer-to-peer, it's clearly on Fluence. You want to own your own data, clearly on Fluence. And you want to take advantage of a wide number of existing kind of modules and services. Fluence is the obvious answer as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me. As you and I have talked about, you've been very, very focused on the ledger layer from in your first project, and now thinking about not quite middleware but business logic and these kind of core services that runs the back end behind the mobile interfaces. Cardstack has been focused on the UI layer, right? Like what is the composability to the UI, to storing the keys on the mobile wallet. We have one on App Store and the Play Store as a way to thinking about smart contract wallet. But eventually you saw the announcement from Coinbase. We like, what do you want to do Do you want to do an MPC wallet so that we can actually have real support more chains and more type of signature scheme? But we chose to use Gnosis Safe to get started. But we do believe that there's a front-end composability really depends on some sort of middleware or business logic tier. Because right now, if you think about everybody else, they're dependent on the node providers, right? Like the Quick Nodes and the Alchemy. They're depending on the graph. They're decentralizing. Those are like still kind of centralized services. Do you see that for teams as building dApps, like as it is commonly understood in our crypto industry, how do you think you can introduce them to Aqua and your runtime as another part of that toolkit for them to imagine the type of application? Do you see them seeing that as a need, the way they kind of like got into Chainlink or got into the graph and say, I see Oracle and indexing being two problems that are incorporated stack. Is it a part of this like greater Web3 development ecosystem, or is this a fork of a different way of doing it?
So I think people, to your point, a tremendous amount of Web3 relies on centralized compute infrastructure.
Yes.
100%. And I say it's not a fault of anybody. It's just there hasn't been an alternative to do that. And so people now have built these systems based on the centralized backend. Is our opportunity to get them to decentralize and retool that back? It might be, or is it more the newer applications that are currently building? And so we're talking to both. Example of a company, Snapshot, that does voting for DAOs.
Yep.
Right now, a lot of that that actual computation happens in Snapshot server, right? That presumably over time should be decentralized. And I think it will be, just a question of how. There's plenty of applications that are building, that are actually looking at using building on Fluence to be decentralized from day one. And I think that's probably easier than groups which are fully focused on, they've already built that, right? It's functioning, it's not hurting anything. They want to do it, they will, but it's not priority one.
Yeah.
But if you're starting off, that's a different story, because it's much easier and simpler to build it from day one this way. So I think we're going to have more, a lot of interest in applications that are kind of building now, and that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of interest as well.
Mm-hmm. So in the new imagination of these new projects coming in that may be like one step beyond the acronym of NFT, DeFi, and DAO. So I consider that one cluster of EVM enabled, and we've seen implementation on other chains. What do you think is the next area where that decentralized compute? You mentioned Snapshot, which is currently the leader in governance, which is a real important things. We're seeing people coming in doing more like enterprise type of thing. Hey, tools to run your DAO tooling is different than just like making a Discord server and gating it. What are you seeing as those use cases that people are like seeking out for the decentralized compute?
There's a couple. One, decentralized identity and decentralized messaging, which which are actually rather linked, because you can't have properly decentralized identity without having decentralized messaging. And a lot of decentralized identity is done right now.
And vice versa. Like, who am I messaging, right?
Correct, exactly. But decentralized messaging or identity now, identities are shared via encryption, which is great, but that's still over centralized messaging. So decentralized messaging, I think, is a critical key thing that, and we actually did a demonstration back in, wow, this is a long time ago. I guess it was December of, not even 21, it was December of 20. We built a decentralized messaging application live in our launch. Wow. And we're able to do that in 10, maybe 20 minutes to show kind of what's possible. So I think that is one key piece of it. I also think, just stepping back for a second, that we haven't talked about this much, but what we're seeing kind of globally is increasing observations of censorship and increasing observations of network failures from scale becoming more and more complicated and leading to more and more issues. And so I think those are two things that are going to drive continued interest in both messaging and applications for which those are problems.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at decentralized messaging as what has, or centralized messaging as what has been gluing together this decentralization movement with Telegram and Discord. And I think we succeeded as an industry despite not solving this decentralized messaging problem, not because we didn't solve it, but when it is actually solved and the rails of the messaging carries with it the message of business and message of finance in a more substantial way. I think it really does connect this to users' life a lot more. It seems like we're chatting about something and then going to very convoluted means to like settle using MetaMask and stuff like that. But if that's tied together, I mean, you got to give the team in status a lot of credit for first imagining this combination of an Ethereum wallet with a messaging solution. But I think if you look at it zoomed out, there are a lot of people working on this. I can't help but to say that you guys beat ICP, the Internet Computer Definitive Launch. In their launch event, they had a messaging system thing, and it seems like some aspects of this kind of like deployment of code to a network of things is similar. How do you see, when people are looking at Definitive Internet Computer (ICP) versus Fluence, are there like clear delineation, or is it really not overlapping because it's serving two different audiences?
So I think it's different in one main way, which is Definity is attempting to solve a similar problem. So very true, but doing it on chain. And so when you do this on chain, you have computation overhead. And to do that, you then need to make sure your nodes, your network has a huge amount of minimum bandwidth and processing power capability, which means you end up permissioning all of your hosts, all of your gateways, right? And so that is a choice, and that's fine. And they're going that route. We have a different route, which is much more of a ecosystem that does not require permissioning whatsoever, and is not blockchain based. And so we're of the view that we use blockchain for the license based system for tracking use of code and for rewarding that use of code and for payments, right? But if you think of us as like Filecoin or even Arweave, right? There, you're using crypto economics to prove and to validate and to pay, but you're not actually storing everything on chain, right? And so that's sort of how we think of Fluence, is your compute is not happening on chain, and so it's not on a blockchain, and so that relieves us of this massive computation overhead and allows a greater deal of flexibility. We just use the blockchain for its strengths, which are traceability, payments, etc. And so that's a design. It's a huge design fork, if you will.
Yeah, I think, internet computer is like, it is a computer, it contains everything in a computer. And you say, well, this is the layer that's missing, and there are many solution layer 1, layer 2 underneath it. It's really about a trusted, repeatable, composable orchestration on top of that, the same way microservices in big companies orchestrate on top of different databases and partner databases. Is that,
that's an interesting, I mean, it's an interesting way to phrase it. I think you've hit it. I haven't thought about it that way. I guess I'd say I agree with your Definity characterization. I would just say that for us, we just want to create this super base layer that on which people can do whatever they want. And our Aqua allows the abstraction of the very complex peer-to-peer application composition. I don't know what the corollary to that is in other projects necessarily, but if I want to build a peer-to-peer application, Aqua makes that far easier, I guess. And I guess you're right, because what others like to say is they've built a lot of that into their system, but that then leads to the overhead we're talking about.
Yeah, and we also see like the other way, right? You have Lazy Ledger, which is now called Celestia, taking that data availability and say, well, what if we can take that away from it? So this decomposition of this all-powerful EVM style everything is really giving opportunity for us to use various solutions to scale it better, right? You can do data availability in a better way if that's all you're doing. You can do computation in a better way if that's all you're doing, and you can maybe even do like UI better if we're doing that way. Like that's what we're working on, right? How do we distribute JavaScript in a way that is not relying on one DNS non-renewal to crash your entire thing and have people steal the fund and hijack the application, right?
Yeah.
So for us, it's like, okay, maybe we should sign the package. People should download it from a CDN. Similar concept, and it's probably what you guys are doing, but in the JavaScript realm. So there's, I think we're starting to become more like specialists. Like we're
Yep.
working on one layer of problem and then put it back together and not be limited by one set of choices made within one foundation or core team. It's really
Yeah.
exciting. It's really
Yeah.
exciting.
100. Yeah. Agreed. I think what you're doing has a lot of similarities in the layer you're working on, without a doubt.
Yeah. And so we have always interested in say, hey, if there's new capability, if it's the graph, we use it. If it's chaining, we use it. If it's Fluence, we want to be able to tap into that stuff to the degree that services where there's interface, whether blockchain or even non-blockchain, like if there's API sources and data sources that we can tap into, we don't want to have to run a server just to be able to get some data, climate data. We're doing some climate stuff, right? It would be
Right.
great
Right.
for there to be a kind of a common interface. So super excited about what you guys are working on. And, I've shared that with you the last time we met in person,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely. Yeah.
What do you think is the is there like a thing that's coming up? Obviously, you're doing a DAO. Is there something in the DAO that you're doing that you think is unique because of the participation, maybe in the economic model versus just like a speculative like community token? Is there something that you're doing there that takes your experience on how to organize community and acknowledge that there's a financial and participation aspect that people always want in this space?
It's funny you mentioned that. We're having lots of discussions about it right now. We have a variety of ideas. We haven't implemented, haven't come to a firm conclusion, but I'll tell you that what to us is important is recognizing there are at least 3, if not 4 different constituencies. You have core team and builders, you have, developer community, you have investors, and then you have, other, I guess the fourth would be kind of, just sort of broader community, if you will. And so figuring out how to involve and get participation from each of those is really important. And, we're trying to determine kind of best ways to do that. The challenge is coin-based voting obviously favors, 1 or 2 groups over the others.
Yes.
So that's not ideal, right?
Yep.
And then if you have, and then if you do delegations and boards, then you start to look a little bit more like companies with the boards, or, so, we like the concept of sub DAOs, where you will then have, groups can propose an allocation to their, group to do X, Y, or Z, where they then have the autonomy to do what their kind of mandate is. And that to me is an interesting way, because the whole community gets to vote. And then that group that has passed that proposal has the ability to kind of then allocate and be delegated that level of responsibility for something. So that's certainly one way to somewhat accomplish those tasks. There's other ways we've talked about this more NFT based, where there's certain communities have a fixed number of NFTs released over some period of time that people then can be voted in on some particular schedule. That, however, starts to look a little bit like a board, and so haven't figured out how to kind of decentralize that sufficiently. But if you have ideas, certainly happy, because we nothing's set in stone yet, and so we're still working it all through.
Yeah, I think the participation model in DAO right now is pretty blunt instrument, right? We have direct democracy through coin holdership with very little weighing, right? Like we talk about quadratic things like that. It happens maybe like 2% of the project even know what quadratic is, right? And we were thinking you'd probably need quadratic, coin lock, threshold based, sub DAO, pod based, right? So we're getting in a situation where the language to describe how these governance work is running against the technical limitation of what you can do, but it's also the fact that I don't think we've tried enough of it yet. So I think it's really good to have projects that are having multiple type of participants. If you look at some of the best DAOs, they typically have one type of people working, and like when they go beyond that, it's like, oh, let's have this social DAO do product development, then they realize they don't really have the talent, and you have product development DAO who doesn't really have that organization thing. So when you have a new ecosystem, yeah, I think making it so that everybody feel like the contribution is somewhere valued and fairly compensated is a really important meta goal, regardless of how we end up solving it.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. And you raised some good points, and it's the one area that I think is interesting is figuring out, and you sort of touched on a little bit, is reputation based, and how you can accomplish that and basically earn reputation points or earn reputation, and then how that can be of value, whether your vote is worth more or less, or and I'm trying to, we haven't, you end up with, to your point, very complex solutions, and then you always have to be careful of how that can be gamed, because no matter what you do, you've got to worry about the gaming. And so it's a struggle.
Yeah. And, the way we look at it is that, when we're dealing with, smart contract, we're dealing with sixth grade math, right? Like there's a mathematics that you can teach a sixth grader, even DeFi project, the most complex one with rebasing and stuff like that. It's not that hard to teach. It's addition and subtraction and multiplication most of the time. With Greek symbols in the white paper, but it's in Excel, is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
What I think we are missing is using kind of data science to look broadly at the whole side. It's very hard to fake when you have a lot of signals and patterns and what they call features to do. So I think part of the value that we're seeing now in the proprietary analytics space, like Chainalysis and stuff like that, they can figure out intent and identify people that you want to give a subpoena to, and very well. But that type of analytics on top of blockchain or public data is not available to a DAO, right? So I think part of it is bringing maybe more data science so we can have better signals. Say, yeah, you can have an NFT, you can have participate and vote, but could I use more analysis to look at that same set of facts and give a better, not a score, that seems crazy, like a China social score, but some more gradation signals that then gets contributed back to the on-chain decision. So I think this idea of adding data science seems like an opportunity that's missed, because I think analytics has been kind of relegated to either like a report dashboard for Nansen or something on the side, but not core to our value judgment on what's going on. But I think if we can bring some of that in, we've, as an organization, we have a data science team. Not many organizations building this does, but we believe that we understand what's going on and we can productize that. Maybe we can kind of bring more of that pattern seeking into this type of who has contributed and who can be fairly contributed and empowered.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you need the data to do that. And so the problem number one is you got to have people to participate, and you have to then, besides voting participation, you have to have signals beyond voting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that gets even harder. So what you seem to be working on is a very difficult problem. And I am anxious to see kind of some of the output of what you do, because that's hard.
Yeah, and then the hardest thing about data science is how do you get the data? But the good news about it is that while we don't have the data now, the nature of this data sharing on storage and compute and these kind of artifacts being captured with base layer, storage layer, is that this will be the most open bottom layer data lake that anybody's ever seen, right? And state level player already appreciate and get the benefit from that. But I think the tools to analyze that base level layer is not there yet. So I think that there's very few people in this land on very little data, but there's a lot of land, and you can see them from top. There's no blockage on it. So this is a longer term thing, but in the short term, even taking into consideration Discord activity, taking into consideration GitHub activity in a more in the consideration of governance, which currently isn't done. Some people do it through source cred and stuff like that, but I think that would be a direction to that thing. At least this is what we think as we're thinking about fair attribution of power and fair attribution rewards. I think those are quite related, I think.
Yeah, no, agreed fully.
So, obviously we're in a very interesting juncture in crypto. I saw the Coinbase ad, crypto is dead. And then there's another tweet from 2 years ago, crypto is dead. And then from 2013, crypto is dead. I thought that was brave and poignant, especially 4 months after the Super Bowl with the QR code bouncing around like a DVD. That's crypto for you. Look about that juxtaposition of a mainstream broadcast at advertising on a sporting event. What do you think is the most likely unlikely event in next year?
The most likely unlikely event.
So I'm just trying to get a prediction.
No, that's let's see. Most likely unlikely event.
Could be good or bad.
I'll say one thing. I'll say is that maybe you view this as likely or not, but I'd say El Salvador, there's a couple of things. So one, El Salvador, I think the main reason they accepted crypto, I think, is to do state-sponsored monetization of their uh, um, geothermal resources. And so I think other countries are taking note. And so I think I think you'd see next year another country effectively doing state-sponsored Bitcoin mining, which is probably not a first world country. It's a country with excess natural resources, whether it's hydro, geothermal, whatever it is. So that's sort of one thing.
Essentially free energy to the state actor.
Correct. That's point. And why not monetize that? You've got unused, turbines in a variety of dams in Africa. Why are you not using those? Why are those not being monetized? And a Bitcoin-based bond is another thing. I also think you'll see a huge, this is a little bit of bias, but I think you'll see the first very big transaction-based use case in crypto, which I think I'm sort of biased. I think Hedera has a couple coming up and that they've announced, which have potentially, billions of transactions. And I think that will be interesting. So that's another big thing I expect to see happen.
Commercial, or is it commercial or financial? Is it commercial transaction?
Commercial, not financial, commercial.
That's awesome.
Which hasn't really happened yet.
No, you need commercial. A lot of very interesting financial vehicle like invoice discounting really depend on commercial to be the underpinning, and it's just a much more solid foundation to build.
Like putting all the coupons in the US on DLT, right? That's in progress, but we haven't seen that actually deployed at any scale yet. But that next year, I expect something like that to happen. 300 billion coupons, right? It enables entirely new use cases, which we could talk about another time. But so those are a couple of there's a couple of things I can think of.
Yeah, what's really interesting about this is that the technology goes on a fairly steady pace, not because we are not working very hard on it as an ecosystem. It's just that inventing technology on the fly is hard, right? This crypto is already a bunch of planes in the air, right? We're just trying to refuel each other and then help each other along the way. But the change of climate, the change on what people are willing to do in terms of governments and commercial activity, which I am like, we need more commercial activity. Because as you know, when you index, you put more stuff on top of just financialization, there's a hollowness to it, and sometimes hollowness collapses in a black hole kind of sense, right? But if you have commercial transactions, if someone is willing to say, hey, I'm making $300 a month and I want to borrow against my future invoices, well, that's the discount the merchant's willing to take some money today that's less than they can collect later on, is the source of the yield, right? Like there's a solid reason why there is a yield. And I feel like without commercial transaction, crypto will only be an invention of capability, but not actually a real pouring concrete on it and building infrastructure you can build on top. So super excited about commercial transaction on blockchains.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Well, this is awesome. I think we cover a lot of grounds. Is there anything you want to say to our community, your community about that Fluence is doing and wants to be able to kind of get the message out?
Well, I guess the first of all, it'd be great to great to be in front of your community, and I guess I'd just say that follow us on we're on Fluence.network, and you can find us on Twitter and Telegram, obviously. And then the other thing I think just worth mentioning is that we're big proponents of the future is peer-to-peer. And we've gone from centralized servers to cloud, and we think peer-to-peer is the future. But all the attributes that we take for granted from peer-to-peer, from censorship resistance to reliability, et cetera, doesn't come by default. That takes work and effort to build. If you were to build it yourself, that takes build like an application yourself, peer-to-peer, takes a long time. Using libp2p, you can do it faster, but you're basically building on metal, and there's a couple elements there that make it faster. But Fluence Aqua actually makes that easy. So we want to effectively be the enabler of the peer-to-peer native applications and make it incredibly easy to build peer-to-peer applications, which we think it will lead to a whole nother explosion of kind of application creativity. So that's what we're focused on, and happy to be here and share it.
Absolutely, and I say this with all the love in the world to developers that I work with and we respect. Developers are lazy. They want to build great things, but they want to find tools that they can rely on that allows them to have that great 15-minute experience the first day, the first weekend, and if you can continue working on that and then providing that really enjoyable success as a builder, that is really why people chose JavaScript or even Solidity, you can do weekend project and succeed. But I completely agree. A lot of developers, I think, are shying away from building on peer-to-peer or even thinking about it because they believe it will be a quagmire that will take them no time. But I can, with my conversation with you and with other people in the space, a lot of progress has been made, and the mainstream press don't even know of any of this thing. And the only way we can actually educate is to say, in kind of marking the time in May, right, of this time, this is actually going on. Real team with real talent and real commitment doing that. The different layouts of the things, but it needs to be recorded because we are actually doing the legwork to make this happen. So thank you for all your efforts on this.
I mean, listen, I'll tell you, I had lunch today with a guy who was ex-Amazon and Uber, right? So he should know a lot about, at least a little bit about crypto. And I explained to him what Fluence was doing and what Hedera did. He's like, wow, I had no idea. I thought it was all financial transactions. I thought, I'm surprised you don't read about any of that in the press.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot happening that people mainstream are not, hasn't kind of, the penny hasn't dropped yet. So I think there's a lot more of that to come, I hope.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for sharing the information on this forum. Hopefully by having builders talk to each other, we can get this information out there. And obviously if it gets picked up and it is something that people they can reference and say, hey, what were they thinking a year ago? Now that we have this likely event happen, they have some context of how that is. So thank you for providing a little bit of prediction. Hopefully you can reference this particular video. Say, I said that
exactly
at that time, right? Well, thank you very much, Tom, for your time, and also, as always, thank you for our community for joining us. And until next time, take care.
Thanks so much. Bye.